The gold is just right for Valentine's Day, isn't it? Really one of my favorite songs. To add a thought about prior restraints, the rule against prior restraints that we discovered in Neer versus Minnesota and applied in Pentagon Papers case and still exists is one, in my view, one of the three ways in which protection for speech in the press in this country is greater than in other countries, maybe than any other countries. Other countries don't have any special prohibition on prior restraints, which of course is censorship. And many countries outright censor the press and restrict individuals from saying what they'd like to say. So the rule against prior restraints is a real important feature of our system. And the other two pillars of our protections for free speech are the New York Times versus Sullivan rule, which we'll consider, I think, next week. That is the protection that we all have for criticizing government. And the third is the rule from Brandenburg versus Ohio that protects the expression of really bad ideas, offensively hateful ideas like racial or religious discrimination and so on. And in most countries, that kind of speech is not protected at all. So with that, we'll leave prior restraints, but we'll come back to it in the context of WikiLeaks. Here's a sort of a Valentine that I found online about heroes and villains, with Julian Assange, is he a hero or a villain, saying, I give private information on corporations to you for free, and I'm a villain? And Mark Zuckerberg saying, I give your private information to corporations for money, and I'm man of the year, as he was on the cover of Time a year ago. It's hard. You can cheer the heroes and hiss the villains if you want, if you can figure out who's who. Julian Assange is a controversial figure, of course. Is he a First Amendment hero, or is he a villain? I'm even suggesting that he might be some kind of hero is offensive to a lot of people, maybe for some of you even. And you can judge him for yourself. All I will try to do in the tradition of Fox News is be fair and balanced. Assange is, of course, the founder of WikiLeaks. He was interviewed on 60 Minutes twice last year, and he wrapped himself in the First Amendment, saying that our founding values are those of the American Revolution, those of Jefferson and Madison. A lot of people think of Assange as some kind of character out of one of those Girl with a Dragon Tattoo books about high-level intrigue and hacker counterculture and conspiracy and sex and so on. He's a fast-moving target. He lives out of a backpack. He's Australian, but he doesn't seem to have any home. He moves from country to country when he can. He's kind of eccentric and volatile. He's an expert computer hacker and now an anti-secrecy crusader. He's currently in England, as you probably know, fighting extradition to Sweden, where he's wanted for investigation on charges of sexual assault. His two accusers say he had sex with them, at first consensually, but then without using a condom, as he had promised. While he's been fighting extradition from England to Sweden, he spent some time in the jail in the same Victorian prison that Oscar Wilde was locked up in. The English lower court ordered him extradited to Sweden. He appealed. He lost the appeal. He appealed to the Supreme Court of the UK, which heard argument 2 weeks ago, and hasn't decided yet. He's free on bail, although he's confined to an estate outside of London. The other character in the WikiLeaks drama is, well, it's the same guy. That's Assange. Is Private Bradley Manning. He's the young soldier and the guy, apparently, who put WikiLeaks on the map. I say apparently because he's only been accused of being the leaker of thousands of military communications about the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and 250,000 classified State Department cables. He started his leaker career, assuming that he indeed is the leaker, by leaking a videotape that had upset him of an American helicopter attack in Baghdad, in which several civilians were killed, including a couple of Reuters journalists. His job in Baghdad in the army was to work on an army-issued laptop, and he had a security clearance to access this database of classified documents. He wasn't singled out for this security clearance. He had the same clearance as about 500,000 other people in the government and in the military with access to this database. Allowing so many people that access seems to be an outgrowth of the movement after 9/11 to decompartmentalize intelligence, so that intelligence could be shared more easily from one part of the government to another, so that the right hand knew what the left hand was doing. But and it's probably a good idea, but I don't know how you're supposed to keep anything a secret that is shared with 500,000 other people. Manning allegedly, he hasn't been convicted of anything. He hasn't even been court-martialed yet. He allegedly copied the databases, these classified databases, onto rewritable CDs that had his Lady Gaga music on them. And he erased Lady Gaga and substituted these classified documents from the government. He's now in jail in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. There have been protests about free by Brad Manning. He has supporters here and there. And is awaiting the court-martial. Last month, the officials in the Army decided that he should be court-martialed, and they specified the charges against him, which of course include leaking all of these documents. This menace to society stands all of 5 feet 2 and weighs 105 pounds. He's tiny, but he has some of the characteristics that I would associate with heroism. If he did it, he didn't do it for the money. He didn't do it for fame, and he didn't do it to hurt his country, but he did it out of some kind of naive idealism and moral opposition to some of the things that our country has been doing, as well as a willingness to to accept the consequences of his actions. But if he's the leaker, he unquestionably betrayed his trust. What WikiLeaks did that has so many Americans upset is first dump onto the internet thousands of military communications, the nuts and bolts of what the military was doing on the ground in Afghanistan, without redacting the names of any of the informants, people who cooperated with the American military there, and putting them at risk. And then their second dump was again, thousands of similar military communications from Iraq. This time, they did do redactions. They edited out the names of informants and confidential source-type people. That exercise in journalistic responsibility seems to have been related to their WikiLeaks coming cooperation with mainstream media, with the New York Times, with Der Spiegel in Germany, and the Guardian in the UK. And then their third big dump was the State Department cables. And when WikiLeaks first released them, they only released a couple thousand out of 250,000. And then last summer, for reasons that are not entirely clear, they released all the rest, 250,000 State Department cables, diplomatic communications around the world. Some of those were first redacted by the newspapers that WikiLeaks gave them to protect diplomatic sources. And until that State Department dump, WikiLeaks seemed to have been progressing from being an indiscriminate dumper of anything that it could find that would be secret, to a more cautious, more responsible organization that at least pretended to be journalistic. For example, before releasing the State Department cables, Assange wrote to the U.S. ambassador in London, in the UK, Julian Assange, editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, and he asked if the United States would help WikiLeaks in identifying in the cables. State Department knew he had the cables because they had been negotiating with the New York Times and the other mainstream media about which ones would be too hot to put out and which ones needed to be redacted to protect various kinds of secrets and so on. And Assange asked if the government would help identify the cables that might put people at risk. And he got a lightning response the next day from Harold Coe, who used to be dean of the Yale Law School, who is the legal advisor to the State Department. And he writes back to Assange, and this response could have been written by John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General, in the Pentagon Papers situation when he tried to stop publication of the Pentagon Papers. Coe accused Assange and WikiLeaks of all kinds of law violations, asserting that publication of the cables would place at risk the lives of countless innocent individuals, journalists to human rights activists and bloggers to soldiers and so on, would place at risk ongoing military operations, would place at risk ongoing cooperation between countries, our allies and others. And it sounds just like Mitchell's telegram to the New York Times. Coe refused to engage in any negotiation, rejected Assange's proposal to do that, and demanded that WikiLeaks stop publishing, demanded that he return all of the classified government material and destroy all copies from WikiLeaks databases. Basically what John Mitchell demanded of the New York Times. To stop for a second there, why didn't the government seek a prior restraint against WikiLeaks' publication of the confidential cables? Mark?
Well, it's possible that WikiLeaks is not American, and not taking your server stuff, and so you can't have prior restraint.
It would be hard to find him and his servers in this country, although I'm not sure that WikiLeaks doesn't have any presence in the United States, and I don't know that for sure. Assume for a second that they do, that Assange were here, and or his servers were here. What would prevent the government from obtaining a prior restraint against disclosure of those cables? Well, put it this way, what would the government have to prove in order to get a prior restraint? Yeah? To what? Yeah, that we can accept that, the standard from Pentagon Papers, as what the government would have to prove in the national security context. That the government, in order to stop the disclosure from WikiLeaks, would have to show that the disclosure would cause grave harm to the national security, immediate harm in the sense that it's causally immediate, that is, there's a direct, close connection between disclosure and the harm, and finally that the harm would be irreparable. Do you think that the government could prove that in the cable context? No? It's a tough standard. Why not? Clearly this relates to the national security. Some of it was, as we now know, since they're all out there, some of it was highly inflammatory stuff about the conduct within other governments. At least one of them, about the Tunisia, the kleptocracy that the dictator of Tunisia was running, started the revolution there. The revelation of the material in the cables released by WikiLeaks. It was potent stuff. A lot of the cables contained potent stuff. Certainly, and remember when as soon as they were released, Secretary of State Clinton was dashing around the world trying to calm other countries down about our inability to keep secret delicate negotiations. Isn't that enough for a prior restraint? Well, it wasn't in the Pentagon Papers because the same government was making the same arguments that the impairment of diplomatic relations would inevitably follow the disclosure of what was in the Pentagon Papers. Very much like it here. And apparently, at least in the Pentagon Papers, that was not considered by a majority of the justices then a grave enough harm to the national security. Or maybe it was grave, but it wasn't irreparable. That is, we could send the Secretary of State around to try to repair relationships and so on. It certainly would have been very difficult legally for the government to obtain prior restraint, even assuming they could catch Assange in our jurisdiction and have a court order him not to publish. Anyway, Assange, after receiving the letter from Coe, responded right away, politely rejecting the government's demands to stop publication and give back all the cables. And the cables were picked up by the New York Times, the other mainstream media, and published all over the world. The Obama White House issued a statement condemning in the strongest terms this reckless and dangerous action. There's a lot about WikiLeaks that I don't know or understand. For example, they apparently have some amazing encryption technology that they use that I don't know anything about. I know a little bit about the First Amendment. Here's my take on where WikiLeaks fits into the First Amendment picture in this country. My thesis is that WikiLeaks basically owes its existence to two weaknesses in our First Amendment protections for speech and the press. Both of these weaknesses stemming from unfavorable U.S. Supreme Court decisions that I unfortunately had something to do with. The rulings were first that there's no constitutional right of access to government information or facilities. That's a case called Houchins versus KQED back in 1978. And we'll consider that case later in the course when we look at whether there's a First Amendment right of access to information. And the second decision, the second weakness in our First Amendment protections has to do with the right of reporters to protect their confidential sources against compelled disclosure. That's Brandsburg versus Hayes in 1972. Earl Caldwell was my client in that case. The court ruled against the reporters in that case, deciding that reporters do not have any First Amendment right to resist the forced disclosure of their sources when the government subpoenas them to come testify before a grand jury. If we had a right to know what our government's up to, and reporters could credibly promise whistleblowers confidentiality, which WikiLeaks guarantees, there wouldn't be much point to WikiLeaks. That's why I say it owes its existence to these two weaknesses in our First Amendment protection. I hope you don't think this is just sour grapes because I was on the losing side of those cases. That's not, if they'd only listened to me, we wouldn't be in this fix. It's really just a recognition that our First Amendment rights aren't as strong as they ought to be. Look, for example, at what's often called, I ridiculed it last week, the people's right to know, which is a nice aspirational phrase that you won't find in the Constitution. We like to think of ourselves as living in an open society with a transparent government, but in fact our government has always hidden its secrets with the blessing of the Constitution and the courts. For example, the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was held behind closed doors, guarded by a sentry in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. All of the debates about the ground rules of our society were conducted in secret. There wasn't any stenographer, there wasn't any reporter there was no press, there weren't any spectators, there weren't any leaks. And the delegates made the fundamental decisions about our society and system with zero transparency. The Constitution itself recognized the need for secrecy. It required each House of Congress to keep a journal of its proceedings, the congressional record now, and to publish it, quote, excepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. That's in Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. And then on the executive branch side, the presidents from George Washington to Nixon and from Bush to Obama have all asserted executive privilege to withhold information from the Congress and also, of course, from the people. Committees and subcommittees in the House and the Senate can and often do sit in executive session in secret, where the people don't get to know what business is being conducted there. And the courts, all three branches are involved in the secrecy business. The courts, too, insist on the confidentiality of jury deliberations, the testimony before secret grand juries, what happens in judges' chambers, not an open court, all confidential. Probably the most confidential proceeding in all of government are the deliberations of the United States Supreme Court. Only the 9 justices participate there, and they don't talk about what was said there. It's true that in 1966, the Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act, known in the trade as FOIA, and that was a good thing. It gives everybody the right to request government records of various kinds, but it has a lot of exemptions, including a very broad exemption for national security records relating to national security, as well as another exemption for law enforcement investigations and so on. In countries that care more about transparency than apparently we do, the freedom of information provisions are enshrined in their constitution, not in just a statute, a law that the legislature passes, but in their fundamental organic documents, their constitution. Sweden, for example, has a whole series of freedom of information provisions right there in the Constitution, right next to freedom of speech, right next to the provisions about how the government is supposed to run. So there's this structure of secrecy that has prevailed throughout our history. And then to bring it into the WikiLeaks era, it was 9/11, of course, that propelled us into a new era of government secrecy during the administration of George W. Bush.